the use of pre-violence in order to engage in the function of censorship to prevent the submission of documents, videos, etc., qualifies the obstructions of associations and other connections so that there is no viable possibility of the connection of various pen pals or the expression of news, at which point the obstruction by the use of terrorism, if you assassinate the documentary, then they cannot submit a document to the public, at which point you have the express position of censorship through the use of violence, qualifying the construct, which is the normalization of the use of censorship through the government secret programs, which is normal to COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and many of the others, with the active use of the function of the restraints against public communications, which is essential to overthrowing the United States in systems that are specifically designed for historic coups around the world, which they have actively engaged in the development of and the normalization of the strategy, such as their coup attempts in the South American countries, where they destabilize the generic public, seeking to get them to overthrow their government, at which point the traumatized public, not willing to use violence against their government, engages in mass migration up to Central America and to the United States, at which point the complaint about the mass immigration derived by the attacks conducted by the terrorist organizations used through the United States government, such as the CIA, etc., qualifies the normalization of socially engineered political problems, qualifying the active complaint against the victims of us directly, and the victims of us directly having the position forced on them are then demonized as intrusive or abusive or whatever needs to be said in order to defame them and discredit them and diminish them so that they can be ignored. Now, with this concept fundamentally laid down as the foundation, you have a series of constructs such as the development of the assumption of romantic interests from the investments of businessmen who would have sought the act of being able to sell more businesses and more stocks and more contracts, etc., by the functionality of connecting their businesses and network of businesses to prospect romantic interests with important people. Now, this is normally understood historically by arranged marriages between nations and marrying rich people with rich people for the joint families' increased wealth is also rather normalized. At which point you have this concept of the attachment of these businesses to the prospect romantic interest for the interest of getting them to increase the sales and distribution of the sale of the companies attached by the agreement with David Bowles as a character in order to engage in the exponentially higher margins derived by the preferred pricing of the things purchased. So the development of the girls, so you have a scenario similar to some kind of Bachelor show, at which point the Bachelor in question would be chosen and the prospect woman would be actively seeking to connect to him on the comparable status and qualities, at which point the Bachelor on the point of victory would have made their various choices, and each layer of the arrangement would assumably increase the function of sales and contracts, etc., until you have the final arrangement where the women in question, who have been developed through their education, specifically accelerating in their opportunities with the companies would find the larger sale of those larger companies as the what do you call it, the a kind of dowry system qualifying the exchange of extreme resources in order to prove or validate the relationship in question, at which point the main benefactors would be the business owners, at which point they're looking for the highest potential sale price for their collective companies connected to the girl, at which point the bachelor in question makes the purchase expressly for the interest of qualifying the girl's education and the development of her business accolades, qualifies the purchase of those companies. So she was partnered with them and then they're purchased, and then the arrangement from the marriage qualifies her action as taking over as the premier president over the company. And then the sellers of the company go and do whatever they want to do with the money. Qualifies the system of the basic concept that many of the people antagonizing in the system wanted to promote, which is a justification of the money aspect of the Portland Girl office, which is a bunch of X's from the projection, girls that would have been X's without the obstructions, and thus are seeking the revenge because their projected failure to have received the contracts in question. Having not received the contracts in question, the sale from their supporting companies wouldn't have been conducted, at which point their normal emotional state is exponentially increased by the fact that they have very important people who have invested lots of money in supporting them and developing them and grooming them into the perfect viable petition, at which point the concept of all competitions is that everyone's fighting over the slightest advantage over everyone else, at which point the subject turns into criminal subversions, and mischief exponentially increases, and corruption exponentially increases, and the use of criminal injuries would exponentially increase. And that is the foundational construct of their engagement of the revenge. So their attacks against David's person as a reaction to David's character qualifies the exponential injury, at which point the use of the suppression and defamation and suppression of status, economic status, associations, isolations, torments, these are levied through the terrorists, at which points they get to pretend whatever they need to pretend, knowing that most of their emotional connections and social signals are conducted through the acts of terrorists connected by the Confederate insurrection, which is more than happy to oblige them from the calculations of having lost through their systematic misuse of their own resources and their validations of crimes and their financial irresponsibility and generic frauds, projects that they would systematically collapse themselves. And the function of them collapsing is the opposite of them winning their political agendas, which they are using criminal coercion and violence over. At which point the revenge X's are seeking to use the terrorists who have projected their failure for the X and for themselves. At which point every emotional signal that the girls would be doing normally in a free society no longer have to be translated as that functional signal, because they have the secret signals, at which point their function of revenge is the function of actively avoiding the subject, the act of preventing the possibility of looking into the due diligence and evidence, the act of actively avoiding the contacts and communications, as to protect through gross negligence and direct willful malice of the suppression and the injury for their insults, at which point their interest is the defamation. Their interest is the insults. Their interest is the collecting of groups for the collective bullying and defamations, at which point the high school concept of the cheerleaders who are actively making fun of the low status people would be the basic concept that they want to do in their distraction, which is how they maintain the prospect of the permanent injury system, at which point the expression of their vulnerability, having been diverted into the terrorist communique, qualifies a different social construct in its entirety. At which point you have the systematic obligation in order to dismantle the system is you have to completely remove the Confederacy and you have to engage in the full legitimate investigation and you have to make the compulsion of the investigation, engage in the individuals involved to go through the full procedure and process and investigation of the due diligence of the information, qualifying their engagement of easing back into the original associations criminally obstructed, which the courts are obligated, if they're loyal to America, to tell them, at which point the renegotiation and resettlement of the estimates qualifies the normalization and dismantlement, at which point that happening would at some point or another disconnect them from the terrorists, and once they're disconnected long enough from the terrorists, the entire system can begin unraveling and their gross negligence and criminal intentions would become plainly obvious. Now, to qualify the justification from the record, from what I've been able to gather, many of them are retaliating because they're from wealthier nations, at which point there isn't exponential amount of margins for them, at which point the use of their investment as already a part of a high status society, already a part of a wealthy community, qualifies their attachments to those already valuable companies, prevents them from creating the additional points from increasing its value, and the expression of them increasing in value increases their status by their use of being supportive of the total company and its connected networks, certifying that the most people made the most amount of money and needed them in the making of that money, qualifying their higher status from their use of functional productive value and the development of that status of being low cash recipients and high status recipients increases their qualifiers of being able to approach better and better sexual options, at which point the increase of the status will also qualify their ability to make better deals, at which point the business or companies which wanted the better value would have to find the girls in question and have to get the accelerant from the margins, at which point it's not just that they're pretty and it's not just that they're smart, it's that they had to have been functionally productive, at which point the higher value wealthy nations could not provide the status that some of the other poorer nations would have been able to have provided, at which point there were many who estimated the exponential advantage to those who would have been in the Slavic coalition over the American coalition or the European coalition, qualifying their active negotiations in their various contests and however that would have been generated, certifying that their higher potential being properly exercised by people of adequate intelligence would have normalized their position inside that society, and at which point the sale at the higher mark qualifies the final value, certifying that they're not engaging in the romantic exchange on the basis of marrying up or being some kind of idol or trophy wife or something along these lines, but an actively valuable woman who has been developing from birth, selected by these companies, which have would have normalized the assumption that this was always going to be the plan, at which point their investments would have been over decades, knowing and grooming and developing the various options in order to perfect the possibility of their success against all competition, which is, again, fighting for every little advantage they could possibly go. If you're going into a race, um, the difference in a particular league is seconds to milliseconds, at which point it's always going to be extremely competitive. The best, most attractive, most viable options will, in most cases, lose because there can only be one winner, that is. At which point, since there can only be one company that wins, whatever strategies that they would have done in order to have generated the winner circle um, leaves everyone else in the having not received the sales cycle.